good morning, everyone. Welcome to the forum on Net Zero with Social Science. This is an event co-hosted by Taiwan Sustainability Hub and the pilot project of social scientific research for Taiwan Net Zero Pathways. So before we begin with the event, we have some tips to help you navigate this event and the surroundings. So first of all, there's free Wi-Fi in this venue. It's called Pop-Up Taipei. And this enables us to be a little bit more paperless. So if you see the name badge, you will see you have a QR code at the corner. This will lead you to our webpage, and all relevant information, including agenda and background information, will be here in the link that you can download. So also on paperless, if you're only attending this event for one day, please leave your badge at the front desk when you leave today. Okay. So, and about the surroundings here, we have coffee and tea at the front desk at the entrance when you entered. You'll be seeing we have some refreshments there. And also because this is an individual building, so the restrooms are next doors. So when we need to go outside, turn left and it will be in the other building. So, and because this is a historical building, the doors are all free to open, but please don't open the windows. They're a bit delicate. So if you want to take a break outside, get some fresh air, please feel free to use all the doors here. Okay, so now back to the event. First, we would like to welcome our co-chair of Chairman of Taiwan Sustainability Hub, Deputy Minister Lim Min-tong, to give a few words to start off this event. Okay, welcome.
Yeah, good morning. I was still preparing my opening remark. I was already called right time. So, good morning. It's me and Ehre. The honor here to begrüßen zu dürfen. Okay. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I think that this is our pleasure. It's also my great honor to welcome you all here in Taipei. Lina actually is prepared a very good opening remark and very rich opening remarks. If I read through all the text, I think that maybe I need more than 20 minutes. Okay. So I will switch to a little bit free style for the opening remark. I think this is, in particular from this location, you can see this is not the conventional conference hall as compared to the big hall and things. So this is kind of the historical building here. We call this the Ping Gai, the bottle cap in Chinese, but in English, the pop-pop. I try to pronounce correctly at home. It's not a pop-pop, it's a pop-pop. Because pop-pop is the voice the noise, you open the bottom cap. I really get to the point, the very creative idea for the pop-pop is actually the very creative idea we need for the net zero emission. That's why we here. I think that we have here two directions to explain why we have this conference or this meeting here. As also, I serving as the chair of the Taiwan Sustainability Hub. I think that you will try to Google if you are try to understand a little bit the background of the organizer here. You will try to Google the TSH. What is TSH? This is a kind of also the creative, I would say, creative idea that times when I was the Director General before I becoming the Deputy Minister of the NSTC or the MOST here. That time we think we really need a bridge to bring the knowledge to action, in particular to have the platform among the stakeholders. This is very difficult, I think, not only for the scholar to the NGO or the scholar knowledge to the action, but also among the NGO, government, and also the scholar. There's a lot of the stakeholders, in particular in the issue of the net zero mission. I think that you are all experienced in the, and in that time, so we think that we need a different kind of the organization to build up such kind of bridge to serve as function for interdiscipline or the transdisciplinary platform to bring the different people to work together with a common ground, but with a different expertise, and jump over actually is from their particularly a spatial knowledge area and or discipline, really listen to the opinion or position from the other people. So this is difficult actually. So we spent almost 1 year to prepare this TSH and also try to find our own way to launch the several events. And this is actually the first event. We are trying to get the contact with the international. Personally, I had already twice visited. I think one is Reese, and another one is the Garris that time. So already 4 years ago, I was pretty impressed. Not only because your budget, that time your budget was also very impressive, but also your transdisciplinary discussion atmosphere was really good and made connection to the real policy. For example, urban or some city planning. I had the discussion, I think, so with the people there in the galleries, spent the whole afternoon, and with that time is IASS, yeah. It's also right now it's Reeves, also different kind of the knowledge and different kind of discipline, the people experts discussing together. I really happy to find some Thomas. He is also physics. I'm physics also. It seems to me he is right now quite happy in the Social Science Institute, right? So, and that time I think that we need to come back to form such kind of the research group. Maybe not only for a kind of the institute. I hope one day we can have also a very good institute serving as a platform for research and also for the communication. But since last year's 2020 March, we launched a so-called new national initiative for the Net Zero 2015. We spent a lot of money, in particular, most of them, I think more than 90% or even 95% on the science and technology. And that time, I think we shouldn't forget the importance of the social science, because the social science give you a long way and a pathway, and also the reflection on your core value till now. So, and I think 2 years ago, we really put also the social science as important part of the SD or R&D project of this national initiative, the Net Zero 2050 for Taiwan. So that's why we are here. So on the one hand, we have the bridge from the TSH. On the other hand, I think that we have the very good transdisciplinary group, research group for the social science in our national initiative. That's basically they will present also and join the discussion here. So this is the background. And what is the purpose of the social science group here in our national initiative? Really, I'd like to make a connection to the government, in particular using the advantage of my position right now. We can really invite the high-ranking officer or some stakeholder from the different ministry, and also connecting to the NGO. We're setting up the common ground and also with sufficient evidence to try to discuss, to make a different conclusion, and to try to also modify or to change or to initialize a new policy of the Net Zero 2050. And that is, we just started, I think, around 6 months ago, right? So it's just 6 months ago. So this is, I think, the background of the history of this TSH and also the social science group here. So I really hope that you can know each other. I try to make friends among us. I will still have a lot of the so-called night activity, so dinner and some tea time and so on. That exactly, I think, is also one of the major part of this our conference here. So I think the why we are doing that is simply because we initialized such kind of the activity from the government very, I think, very recently only. as compared to the countries in Germany, also, for example, Germany and also a Nordic country, which I just spent almost 18 days to visit Norway and also the Finland and also Aberdeen, Scotland, and so on. We see a lot of the effort making on that since already maybe 10 years or even more than earlier than 10 years. So we just started right now. So, we are facing a lot of challenges, not only from the scientific and the technological issue, but also the societal problem. For example, the just transition we are facing. If we transfer, if we have the transition for the industry, we need to face also unemployment. And that is touch also the critical issue of the so-called our social system. So that exactly, I would say this is also the weak point of the whole country in Taiwan as compared to the Nordic country or even in Germany. So really very good social network, social safety network there, already there. This is a background. So we have different baseline, not only in the science and technology, but also in the social society. That is all thing we need to face. That is also why so important the social science people here. So this is the first thing that we need to change it here. Okay, so I think that almost say something important I needed to say. I try to go through. So, okay, Popo, I think that I should a little bit make a brief introduction to this place here. So this is a new area of the research cooperation, Popo. I get here at the historical venue, Pop-Up Taipei, witnessed the transformative change in his history. The Nangang Butter Cap Factory, established in 1943, this is history. So during the Japanese colonial rule, played a crucial role as a local coke manufacturer. So this actually is also a kind of a transition. For several decades, it is surprised even parts of the 14 wine factory, the beer factory or the wine factory. Beer. I think that we don't have so many wine here. This is a beer factory across Taiwan until its closure in 2004. After years of abandonment, the Taipei City Urban Regeneration Office undertook its transformation into a so-called urban regeneration platform in 2010. This is exactly the status you see today. This historical site was later rebranded Pop-Up Taipei and officially reopened on the December 5th, 2020. Now it is served as a dynamic space for the various events, including meeting, exhibition, seminar, workshops, musical performance, night markets, and more. So I think I'm almost done. I encourage everyone to make the most of these 2 days, engage in fruitful dialogues, fostering new partnership, and exploring innovative cooperation. Take the chance to interact with unfamiliar face. I think that every 2 days you will be familiar with each other. For your potential project, the partner might be right here, waiting to connect together. We can shift from an industry-driven model to a more sustainable and socially just one, I mean in Taiwan. So I wish you all a healthy and fulfilling and enjoyable 2-day events. Thank you, and Pop-Up. Good, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the heartfelt opening. So before we start with the first panel of the day, we would like to take a group photo of all of you from the front back, so please remain seated. You don't need to move. We'll take it from the stage here. So please put on a smile. And 3, 2, 1. Okay. Okay, 3, 2, 1. 关掉。投影机可以先关掉。Okay. Sorry, we had a little bit glaring from the projector. So one more time, smile please. In 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you. Okay, so now we'll start with the first session, panel session of the day, first keynote speech of the day. So this speech is by Professor Dr. Ortwin Renn from RIFS, Germany. And this session will be moderated by Deputy Minister Renn. Okay. Please welcome.
Thank you.
According to the program, I need to introduce you formally. The Professor Dr. Ortwin Renn, actually, I would say he has become one of my good friends, right? We met here in the world, I think it's already third times. I'm very happy. Professor Dr. Ortwin Renn is a retired scientific director at the International Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies, IASS, in Potsdam, Germany, and a retired professor for environmental sociology and technology assessment at the University of Stuttgart. He also directs the non-profit company Dialogic Research Institute for Investigation of Communication and Participation Process. I think his research interests include risk, governance, analysis, perception, communication, stakeholder and public involvement, energy policies, transformation process, and sustainable development. I think this is almost all of what we needed today. Okay, let's welcome Professor Renn. Okay, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Please allow me to do this from the stage because I have all my slides here that I don't have to turn back. First, I feel very honored to be here this morning, and I feel that it's coming somehow also home because I've been to Taiwan third time right now, and I also see a lot of faces that I'm familiar with, and I'm very delighted to be here, and I'm very excited about the discussion that we're going to have. The topics that I would like to talk with you is about advancing net zero technology in democratic and pluralist societies, opportunities and barriers. And what has been said before by Dr. Lin was that we look we investigate the technology and also very often the economic conditions of net zero transition, but we sometimes overlook or neglect the social transformations that we need to undergo in order to become a net zero society. The starting point from which I would like to take you into this journey into the social science of net zero society is what we call the transdisciplinary research perspective. And that perspective includes kind of three major elements. One is that we need something what we call systems knowledge, and that means we have to know what kind of challenges we'll face due to climate change and due to other global changes that we encounter. And that system knowledge also includes, of course, all knowledge about society, about economics, also about humanities. That's something, it's a background, it's a classic science element. Secondly, we need orientation knowledge, and that means we need to know where we would like to head to. What is the target that we want to have? And the net zero society is only a big headline, but we have a lot of targets, a lot of orientations, and just transition is just one of those targets to make sure that we also include social justice elements into our transformations. The third one is transformation knowledge, and that means how do we get from where we are, systems knowledge, to where we want to go, orientation knowledge, and that's not trivial. We need to find out what are the best scenarios, what are the best policies, what are the best educational programs that help us actually to reach the goals that we have specified in the orientation knowledge. And lastly, and that's something fairly new into this transdisciplinary perspective, we need to have process knowledge. And I will focus specifically on that point because I was asked to it. Any of these is interaction between orientation, transformation, and systems need new processes, specifically in democratic societies where people want to be part of the decision-making process, where we have stakeholders, where we have NGOs, where we have different policy levels. All of them need to interact in order to make that transition possible. Yeah. Now, what are the conditions for reaching net zero in a democratic and pluralist society? And the first thing is, and that goes back to the systems knowledge, we need to get the science right. And we also know we have a lot of fake news in the world. We have a lot of disinformation. And it's very important that we have the best state-of-the-art science, the best physics, the best chemistry, also the best social sciences that help us to navigate through a whole jungle of knowledge claims, of which many are not correct. So we need to be very clear about what is a good science. We need the best expertise of what needs to be done to reach net zero. The second point is we need to elicit the concerns of the main stakeholders and the affected publics, meaning what are people worried about? And I think that's very important because if we neglect this, then we cannot get people enthusiastic about the transformations that they need to undergo. So we need to understand their thinking. And that can be done through surveys, through focus groups. We have a whole set of social science methods to do that. The third thing, and I will get back to this too, is develop a very convincing narrative, or maybe several narratives, for the necessary transformations, as well as for the future vision of what Taiwan will look like at the end of the tunnel. And I think that's really important. Very often our narratives are only about the pathway, about what we need to do to reach net zero. But in order to convince people, we always have to say, what is after we've gone through that transition? Why is the future better? What are the kind of, I'd say, expectations that we have about society that has reached that level? Because nobody wants to go through a hardship if it's not worth it. And I think that's very important, and sometimes we miss the point of why we need to go there and what can we expect once we have reached that goal. The fourth thing is, and that's where I will focus most on in my talk, is design a stakeholder and citizen participation program that is based on co-creation of narratives and equal opportunities, just transition, for generating strategies and measures for reaching net zero. So this is a really important part because in a pluralist democratic society, we need to get people involved. It's not just that we have to convince people, that's also important, but we need to get them involved. And that means integrate stakeholder input and public preferences in order to construct consistent policies. And I think Professor Lin made that point very clearly, that we need to find the bridge between what social science, natural science can do in order to really inform policymaking. Now, there are three main steps for inclusive and participatory involvement of stakeholders and citizens. The first one is we need to establish criteria for meaningful and impactful stakeholder and citizen participation and deliberation. So we need to know why are we doing it and what are quality criteria to assess or evaluate our process. So we're really in the realm of process science. So we need to have good processes. Secondly, we have to analyze and assess the merits and boundaries of existing tools, formats, and processes for participatory and deliberative processes. That means if we know what the criteria are, what are the best process designs that help us to make these criteria come alive? And that's not a trivial task. Very often we know what should be done, but we don't know how to do it. And that's something I would like to focus on in my second part. And the third part is develop methods and procedures to co-generate narratives in reaching net zero as a part of this participatory process. Now I start first with the criteria, then go to the second one, and lastly to the third element. So the first one, as I said, was establish criteria for meaningful and impact stakeholder and citizen participation and deliberation. And in our work, we found out that these 4 criteria are quite important. This is not exclusive. We can have an endless list of criteria. As a matter of fact, we just ran into a big European project we called Real Deal, and we came up in total of around 30 criteria that are being raised in the literature, but those are the ones that we feel are the most important. The first one is fairness, and fairness means we have to include everyone who is affected by a policy. We need to represent all the relevant arguments. So when we say, well, we have option A or option B or option C, what are the pros and cons of each of these? And we can only do this not just by scientific assessment, but also by eliciting the preferences and the values and the interests of those people affected. And we need to represent these interests and values. So that's the first thing, is real inclusion of fairness. And this afternoon, we're going to have a session on this aspect specifically. The second one is competence. And as I said before in the beginning, gets the science right and gets the right science. Both is, I think, very important. So competence has 2 elements. One is communicative ability, which means that everybody can really discuss with everybody else, and that's also not trivial. So we have to write format to make this discussion viable, that everybody can contribute. But we also need substantive validity, the meaning that what we are saying does have scientific merits. The third thing is legitimacy, and legitimacy means that something is being justified, also in the eyes of those who do not participate. So it has to have a radiant effect on those that are also observing it. So we need transparency. Everything what we're doing need to be transparent, need to be clear, need to be open, nothing behind back doors. And secondly, it should be compatible with all the legal decision making. The Germans have a very nice word for this called Anschlussfähigkeit, which we cannot translate it to English. Probably I don't know about Mandarin. But it means that whatever comes out of this process can be integrated into the regular policy-making process. And again, that's not easy, because very often there are open windows of opportunities, and then you need to add something, and sometimes these windows are closed, and so we need to find the right time and the right format in order to make things happen in the policy world. And the last one is efficiency, and again, that's an important thing. You don't want to waste resources, also social resources, social capacity, because all of that needs time and it needs resources. So we need to have an effective goal attainment, that you really reach the goals that you have aspired, and secondly, an economical use of time and resources. Now, these 4 criteria are very good in order to find out whether the process of how to integrate stakeholders or how to integrate public is an important yardstick, where you can say, is it fair, is it competent, does it add to legitimacy, and is it in the end efficient? And of course, there are other things that you need to include, but those are the 4 ones that I think are extremely important. Now I'll get to the second point, which actually is the point that I would like to spend most of my time, and that's to analyze and assess the merits and boundaries of existing formats, processes, and tools of participatory deliberative processes. So how do we do this? How do we really implement these 4 criteria into making a very meaningful and also effective and productive participation process? So the first, there are 2 major questions, and I think those are the most generic questions that you have to ask when you design a citizen participation process or a public and stakeholder involvement process. The first one is inclusion, the second one is closure. And that's very generic. The first one is, whom do you include and what do you include? And the second one, how do you reach closure? Because those are the 2 major elements in any policy process that you're engaged in. So inclusion is, whom do you include? Stakeholders, scientists, different parts of the public, or all of them. Sometimes that's too much, and we have to make a clear decision. Who is the audience? And again, you always exclude someone. There's no way to include everyone. And you have to make a very prudent decision here, again on those criteria: fairness, legitimacy, efficiency, competence, whom you are going to include. What are you including? Are you including options, policies, scenarios, frames, preferences, whatever? Again, it needs to make a decision there. You need to think about the scope, and we're getting back to the governance issues. At what levels are you actually doing this kind of participatory process? And then it's also limitation in space, time period, future generation space. So all again, you need to put up some boundaries. And in the end, you have to reach closure. You have to get some kind of a result. And so closure is what counts as evidence. Again, that's an important element. So interest is not knowledge. Knowledge is not values, and how you distinguish between those. You have a competition of argument. Which argument is more convincing than others? And you need rules for that. And in the end, what option is selected? What suggestion is being basically produced at the end of this format? And you can have a decision-making rule. It could be consensus, which we normally prefer, not always possible. You can have a compromise in the end, or you can have some kind of a voting model. So any format you choose, you need to ask those 2 questions: whom to include and how do you end with this? And if you have that being specified and also justified, that's probably 80% of success. Just those 2 questions. Now, I know something wrong. Yeah. Now, I said about governance, and again, I think that has also been mentioned by Professor Lin just a few minutes ago. It's important at what level are you addressing your audiences. So you have what we call vertical governance and horizontal governance. Vertical governance is the hierarchy. So you have political bodies ranging from the community level up to regions, to states, countries, to international level. At what level are you actually positioning your discourse? I mean, very often it's good to do it on the community level because people know each other and then it becomes more visible. But sometimes, you know, like net zero, it has to be more than community. You probably have to put it on the national level, sometimes even at least with a link to the international level. But then the second question is a horizontal governance. And horizontal governance means the various stakeholders on each vertical level. So we have stakeholders on each level, the community level, on the regional level, state level, international level. And then you have different stakeholders, we call it organized groups, with an interest in the issue, including the private sector, industry, and also NGOs. But you also have experts from very different fields: physics, meteorology, social science, humanities. You may have multipliers like the media, opinion leaders, and lastly, and that's also important, we have, of course, people who are affected by it. So just the ordinary citizens. All of them are part of your horizontal governance, and you have to think about, when you talk about inclusion, do you include all these at the same time? Do you have separate processes for each of them? That's something you need to decide. What are the specific requirements in order to make this process work? And these are, again, not all of them, it's not exhaustive, but the ones that are most relevant here. The first thing is, whatever you do, it's very important to have a very clear mandate and a clear time frame. It's nothing more boring than if you have a process which doesn't end. It goes forever. People are getting tired, and then you have more and more people coming in. It's very important that you develop a time frame and saying, well, this is the starting point, this is the end point, and that is what we want to accomplish, and this is a mandate that this group has. And it's very important to make sure that the mandate is well developed. Otherwise, you disappoint people in the end if people come up with a wonderful conclusion and you say, well, that was outside of the mandate. Well, that's very frustrating. So it's very important to have a mandate at the beginning and say, look, guys, this is what we want to accomplish. These are the boundaries of what we can accomplish. And this is the time frame in which we work. The second thing, and I'll get back to it, is we need convincing narratives so that people can identify with those transformations. That is something that lies at their heart rather than just in their brain. We need to have a range of available and suitable options. So if you only have one option, don't do participation, because then there's only yes, no, doesn't make any sense. You have to need the willingness of legal decision makers to give product of participation serious attention. And Professor Lin already made that point, that you said, well, you are now at a link between academic research and policymakers, which is great that you have that link available, but it's very important to nurture that link and to make sure that what comes in from those processes can be handled and processed by the governmental agencies. You need to have the willingness of all parties to learn from each other. If people come in there and say, this is my position and I don't want to change anything, it's difficult. You need to see that people feel that they can learn from each other. That's very important. And refraining from moralizing other parties of the position. Not that moral arguments are not important. On the contrary, they're very important. But if you demoralize others, that's the end of all participatory processes. You have to respect everyone who takes part in this. Now, these are the basic concept of stakeholder and citizen participation. I don't want to go deeply into this. It's a little bit crowded here. What I just want to point out that it's very important to say there are different kind of philosophies behind various participatory processes. And they can be either functionalist, that's meaning everyone who has knowledge can be participating, normally experts. It can be what we call neoliberal, that means everyone has a voice and we do a voting at the end, very popular in the United States. It can be the deliberative rational discourse where it only depends on the kind of arguments and there's a competition of arguments and then the best arguments wins in the ideal world, the so-called Habermasian view of the world. It can be anthropological, that is you have a jury of maybe citizens or stakeholders that then deliberate for all the others in order to reach a specific position. It could be emancipatory, meaning that you take specifically those people that are not often involved in decision making and give them a voice. So specifically give people who have weak voices in society to have a more important voice, and a more postmodern version where you say, well, we want to really get all the visions that we have in the world, but we don't make a decision in the end. It's just that we have this view that there are alternatives available. As I said, I don't want to go too deeply into this, but it's something where you can see in the design of discourse methods that there is a different set of concepts, and very often in Germany we are trying to do a combination of the functionalist and the deliberative, which we call the analytic deliberative combination or method, analytic deliberative method. It's also being endorsed by the United States Academy of Sciences. They have 2 reports on this, on the analytic deliberative processes. So it's a combination of getting experts together to be functional, to make sure that it works, and then we have a deliberative process with stakeholders and the public to make sure that all arguments, interests, and values are being included. So those is a combination of two of this, so the functionalist and the deliberative. These are just a slide about the various formats that we have in order to make these kinds of processes work. And you can see there, this is a way that we can say, well, there's on the left side more expert input, on the right-hand side more layperson, so general citizen input, and on the y-axis we have one that is more consensus-oriented, where a decision is being made in the end, or more input orientation, where it's a more or less an information for policymakers about the array of various options, visions, arguments of different actors. And you can see here a whole lot of different formats, and I don't want to go deeply into all of them because that would take much more time than needed. But I think at this point we have, probably more than 100 different formats. Some of them are very similar, some of them are very different, in order to make those 4 criteria come alive, as I've said before. Now, we have been working with these formats here, and I think, and again, that goes back to the combination of analytic or functional and deliberative methods. The first one, which I think is very interesting, is the citizen assembly or citizen forum format. And that's something where the inclusion is all people that are affected. And we'll take a random sample of these people. So everyone has the same opportunity to be drawn into this deliberative body, and it provides opportunities for non-organized people to come in with their preferences, with their concerns, with their desires of what needs to be done. And in Germany, we just had the first national assembly on climate change policies. It just has happened, and we were very much involved in this. I was actually the chair of the academic advising committee. And again, that's very interesting. We had 168 randomly selected citizens representing more or less all, I'd say all different interest groups and all different societal groups. And they had around 6 weeks to deliberate about a whole set of options, what the German government should do in order to improve climate protection. And that was a very interesting topic, and it was also highly publicized. The second is roundtable stakeholder panels and hearings. This is something in order to get the organized people, the NGOs, the private sector, to get interest groups involved. You don't get them with citizen assemblies or just by chance. But they're very important because they are organized groups that help you to either meet your goals or they will be opposing them. So you need to be very clear that you have them as your allies into getting the net zero society. And roundtable, kind of putting people together around table, looking what they have to say and then coming up with some kind of a conclusion is very important. The 20th century town hall meetings are a good way, that's a US-based format in which you take a whole large group of people. It has its advantages and disadvantages like any other process, but the advantage here is that you get a whole lot of people involved, 2,000, 3,000 people. You can do it online or offline. Usually nowadays we do it online. Focus group is another way of involving people. We are using focus groups in our Real Deal projects that I mentioned before to get specifically disadvantaged communities or disadvantaged social groups into a role of being a part of the process for deliberation. You don't get them in most of the citizen assemblies because those people decline to be part of the process. They just say, oh, I'm a low income, low education. I feel more marginalized in society. So you need to get those people in a kind of an extra format. And focus groups seem to be very good because then they are among themselves and then they can really address their concerns. I talked about the analytical deliberative discourse already. That's combining some of these ways, and specifically, and that's why I put it last, when we look for functional input from experts, then we use very often a method called group Delphi. It's a very good technique for bringing expert advice and knowledge into these deliberative processes, specifically finding out what is the state of the art, even in very contested areas. There are, of course, boundary conditions of all of these different discourse methods. The number of participants and duration of event, of course, always limited. I said this before, mandated time. Priority may be placed more on legitimation than very often we want to have stakeholders, or is more in inclusion, then we have more affected citizens, and or closure, then we want to have people that can reach closure, and we don't want to have too much controversy around it. So depending on the priority, you have also boundaries. It's always a boundary. What is the governance level at which you do this, and how do they interact with each other? Content and complexity, I think that's fairly obvious. How do you prepare your participants? Do you prepare them in advance, or is it just a process that everybody has to go through without any prior education? Again, that's a decision to be made. Moderation, and of course, what kind of output you want to design in the end. Is it a report? Is it a policy brief? Is it an oral presentation to the policymakers? Is it something new that we're trying to do now? Is that these kind of participatory bodies interact with policymakers over time? So it's not just a one event, but it's several events in a row that seems to be more effective. Now let me come to my last point, and that's develop methods and procedures to co-generate narratives in reaching net zero as a part of the participation process, because I was asked to specifically also focus on the issues of narratives. Why are narratives important? The first thing is narratives provide meaning. There's a sense-making for all stakeholders and citizens, and they're more than just educating people about models and statistics. That's also important. It's very important to make sure that people understand the science behind it, at least the basic science. But people will not identify with statistics. They will identify with narratives. And narratives are stories that helps them to find identity in the process of transformation. That's very important. People don't like to get transformed, but they do like to be actors in the transformation. They have to find their own role in the transformation. What does it mean for me, and what is my role in this, my function in this, and why should I do it rather than somebody else? That's a narrative. And these narratives have a strong power because they provide people with something that say, oh, now it makes sense to me. Why should I do it? And it's very important to have these narratives. Now, the problem with narratives is you cannot fabricate them. People very often think, oh, I fabricate a very nice narrative and then impose it on somebody else. Won't work. The only way to deal with narratives is to co-generate, help people to develop their own narratives. That is an important element, and of course you can use existing narratives that are there and then to build upon them, but you can also get people being very creative about these kind of narratives. So they need to be co-created. They help to make a green future become transparent, alive, and imaginable. It has images. And it could be illustrations, but it can also be verbal descriptions. It can be experiences like we have here, going outside in nature, and then suddenly say, oh, why don't we have that at home? And then we can see what we can do in order to get there. They help to cope with complexity, because very often illustrations can help us to think holistically rather than putting a lot of complex analytical parts together, which of course is very difficult. They facilitate communication decision-making, specifically in deliberative processes. Our experiences is that if people talk about narratives, they can talk with each other. If people talk about models, well, then we have a problem. And so in that sense, it's almost like a translator for different types of concerns, for different people's perspectives. And lastly, they can provide identity. Now I know what my role is in all of this. It can also include empowerment, because if you know your role, you also know what your agency is in all of this. You can see how can you transform yourself as well as the others, and it provides agencies and a feeling, a spirit of community. That's the last thing which was missing here. Now let me come to my summary. So what are the participatory requirements for reaching net zero? And I focus specifically, as I was asked, into involvement of stakeholders and citizens in analytic deliberative processes. First is inclusion, and important there is that you have a fair representation of relevant stakeholders, the general public. It's still, you have to make decisions whom to include and whom to exclude, but it needs to be a deliberate, justified decisions. Secondly, you need to have convincing narratives, and they should be co-generated with those with whom you want to work. This is describing what the process is and what the end results could be. Third thing is legitimacy, combining experts' input, stakeholder deliberation, and citizen participation. So we have always three types of input in course, addition to the policymakers themselves, is we have experts that have analytic functional knowledge. We have stakeholders, we have basically interests, but also specific knowledge about their field of expertise. And you have citizens who have their own values, their own expectations. And to put them together, it's not easy. And I said, this deliberative analytic process can help you to bring them together. So the concepts and formats is you combining the analytic set, group Delphi may be a good method to do that, with deliberative formats, roundtable and citizen assemblies. And that's what we normally would say suggest or recommend among the maybe 50, 60 different formats that are out in the literature, that you do this kind of combination. First, a kind of analytic screening of, what do we know about it? Then to have a roundtable, what do stakeholders think about it, and how can we get them together? And then we have citizen assemblies to also get the view of the citizens. Integration results need to be incorporated in business strategies and public policies. It's very important that this link between the various processes are being realized, because otherwise, you have things just flying in the air, but it has no impact. And lastly is important, as much as we know already, we don't know enough, and every process is different. So there is some uniqueness in each of these processes. So it's very important to evaluate it and to make sure we learn from each process to improve the next process. So all processes should be closely monitored and reviewed. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. What I would like to emphasize here is the deliberative process for involving stakeholders and general publics are both. They're instruments of science, and science is transdisciplinary science, also including social sciences and process knowledge. But they're also instruments of art, meaning that you need good designs and very, let's say, enthusiasm about these things in order to be convincing to others. So they require a solid theoretical knowledge, but also a personal propensity to engage in group interactions and lots of practical experience. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we are coming to the time for Q&A, but maybe you can sit down, right? Okay, so according to Rita, so that we can take a seat here.
Yeah.
So I think so after the talk, listening to the talk of the Professor Renn, so we know how difficult the situations we have right now, in particular in Taiwan. if you like to find the pathway or the approach to the net zero emission. Okay, so right now it's open for the question. I think the Chao is there. Okay, so here's a question. I see. Okay, so this first one. How important is it to have the people's agreement for the participatory approach for the net zero deliberation discussion on how to discuss? Take time. So, yeah, speak larger. Can you see that?
Yeah,
this is a question to you.
Yeah, okay, fine. Thank you very much. Well, if you listen to my talk, you can imagine that I would say, yes, it is important. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. And I think sometimes it's underestimated. And we have the same experience in Germany very often. We have these abstract talks, also as policymakers. They all say, oh, yeah, Ortwin, that's true what you're saying. But you know, we have to have this parliamentary vote tomorrow, and then we have this other meeting next week, and we have to get an answer right now. And, you know, we have so many people in our office that try to convince us to do something differently. It's great what you're saying, but the policy arena is different. And it's true. I mean, you know, it's not that we deny it. On the other hand, what we can see, we've just seen it in Germany in a very, let's say, a sad way, that if you push things through in a democratic society, it doesn't work. We just had this so-called heating amendment in the German law, and the German Minister for Economics, who is a very strong advocate of net zero, he wanted all the German households to change their heating systems, or if they change the heating system, to have renewable heating systems. He did not go into a real good public participation process. He just announced it more or less. Then it found out that there were some problems with it, and the trust in government has dramatically decreased. And that has real strong consequences. At this point in Germany, just yesterday, 22% of the German population said they would vote for very right-wing parties. Every fifth person. And if you had asked me that last time when I was in Taiwan 3 years ago, I would have said, no way, not in Germany anymore. But it's wrong. And if you don't get this right, in terms of getting stakeholders and citizens being engaged, and I'm saying again, it's not just convincing, getting engaged in them, this will be very, very difficult to get implemented. And you know, you need to see that that kind of deliberation is a part of the process to make those transformations go smoothly into the societal discourse.
Okay, thank you. Some more questions? Yes, please. Wei, yes.
Yeah, now we have a few. That's great.
For the second.
My first question is, I think it's quite often we can see the conflict opinion among the group of stakeholders. So how to deal with all these kinds of conflicts to make any kind of different, you mentioned lots of different kinds of formats people can participate, and how to really get convincing conclusion or consensus among the group. This is my first question. And the second question is how to involve a more vulnerable group or minority group. It seems it's quite, we frequently hear that they will probably say they don't have time or they are not interested. And the third question is how in your country you have I think we need more human power to involved in all this kind of process knowledge, or to deliver all this kind, or any kinds of form of deliberative democracy. So it seems to me in Taiwan we still short of human power in to involve in all these kinds of political process, and how you encourage people or create or provide institutional resources to make more people involved in all this public engagement. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There were 3 questions, and hopefully I remember all of them, but please tell me if I don't. I'll start with the last one. You're absolutely right. If you want to do these kind of processes, you need people who are trained, educated, and also have experience in moderating or in designing these processes. When I was still at Stuttgart University, we installed a very new master program in citizen participation or public participation and planning. And we have around 60 students each year. And it's a 2.5-year process in which we really help those people to become good moderators, to good designers. And they can come from all kinds of different fields, from social sciences, natural sciences, but they get the 2.5-year training. And that certainly is an issue to get capacity building. The second point is that we now have a whole set of, say, private companies who have specialized on this. And these private companies are doing quite well now. They didn't do well in the past because there were not such a demand. But now with all the transformations, there is a lot of demand, also on the community level. So these companies also learn by doing. Very often there are companies that came from more communication, public relations. In the beginning, they just had the model of convincing citizens. They found out that's not the right way to do it. So they're now becoming much more co-creative in the last point. So I think that's necessary. And if there's a possibility also for you to think about like education in universities or other kind of institutions, that I think would be a really good way to go forward, because those people who graduate there are then well informed to do that. Your second point about marginalized groups, I mentioned it only briefly. We have a hard time to really get those vulnerable groups included. And at this point, the European Union has given us some money to test different methods to get vulnerable groups involved. And my reading from the empirical research that we have done is that focus groups is the best way to do it. And focus groups means you address these vulnerable groups directly and say, you, vulnerable group A, come together with how many people you want, but you are by yourself. And then, we have this kind of focus group, a group discussion, and since they are among themselves, they start to become much more expressive than if they are in a group with people with high education or, who are very eloquent and so on, then they don't talk. And that's something very important. We have called it the avoidance of the zoo effect. We have seen a lot of citizen participation groups in which we had 1 or 2 vulnerable people, and they were put on TV and so, look, no, we also have this indigenous person, and we also, look, we have this, and then they are in a zoo, and we don't want that. And so giving these people a more kind of an arena of empowerment is extremely important. Again, it's not easy to get them to be involved, but we found out that this kind of focus group idea seems to be the best working model in Europe. And your first question, I hope I got this right, is about how to get these very different interest groups and different value groups together to form a compromise on different governance levels. It's the easiest on the community level because they share the same kind of environment. And what we very often find out at community level is to say, okay, how can we make your life in your community better? And everybody has an interest in that. And then you can see that interest groups who have very controversial views can come together on that kind of specific idea, and it's very often obvious what makes community life better. The higher your governance level, the more difficult it is, because then things get more abstract. And if things get more abstract, you have all the issues of controversy, and you have whatever different perspectives. And what we try to do there is to get a kind of a ping pong game, for example, between stakeholders and citizens, that they develop something and they feed it back to the others, and then they respond to it and they feed it back to the first group again. That helps very often to reach at least a consensus. We had a very interesting example. It was a climate protection plan of the state of Baden-Württemberg, which is a state in Germany, where we had stakeholder forums on one hand side and randomly selected citizens on the other side, and we had a third group which was just online people. And we had a physical meeting of the three groups, and it was very interesting, in a sense, very German, because all of the stakeholder groups came with a tie and with a suit. All the citizens came in normal jackets, and all the people who came from the online groups, they had ponytails and looked like nerds. And it was funny, you know, all the three groups came together and they looked at each other and saying, well, can we come up with a consensus? The interesting thing was, first thing we asked them, where do you agree? And we found quite a few things where they agreed. The second thing was, and that was something new, we said, is there something that one of you feel is extremely important and the others say, we don't care? And there were quite a few things like that, where some groups felt extremely enthusiastic about this. They say, oh, this is deeply into my heart. And the other group said, well, if you feel like it, I wouldn't have endorsed it, but so what? And the policymakers in the end said those were the most important recommendations, because they could say, well, we can actually serve several people without offending others. Well, that was something new for them, the policy field. Then there were things that were clearly controversial, where people said, you know, and we just left it like this. We said, you don't have to find a compromise here. And the policymakers can see, you know, do you want to serve more one group or the other? And the last thing was when nobody cared. That was also interesting. And there were quite a few things where people said, well, if that's happening, we don't care. So these kind of four elements are very important in order to reach something like a product, and it doesn't have to be a consensus all the time. If you are on the international level, I think that's very different. We have had quite a few examples of citizen panels on the international level. Actually, the World Bank has done this. We have was another one on again on energy, run by the Swedish government. I'm a little bit concerned about this, because in the end, when you do this with whatever, 150 countries have randomly selected citizens and then come together, it's getting extremely expensive. And in the end, I think most of the recommendations were motherhood and pie. They were not really substantive. And so I think on the international level, I would think you probably need to deal with governments or with organized groups. Then it's really difficult to go further down to have ordinary citizens involved. I don't know if that was your first question. Okay. Okay, there's somebody
over there. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your insight. I would appreciate the opportunity to ask two questions as follows. The first one is, just like deliberative democracy theories argue for consensus, how can collective shared narratives overcome fundamental conflicts between labor class and the capitalist? The second one is, if there are different views and theories on narratives among disciplines, how can interdisciplinary research employ to uphold coherence and effectiveness?
Well, thank you very much. I'll start with the second question. This is a very interesting point about, you know, what is the role of narratives also in interdisciplinary research. And we see that, you know, quite a few disciplines have a hard time thinking in terms of narratives because they have been so formalized. And interesting enough, it's not so much the physical sciences. There's sometimes, specifically physics now with, quantum physics and others start to have their own narratives, which are very different from popular narratives, but they can see how things fit into some kind of, there is a perspective around things. Chemistry is more difficult because they have a very clear language in which they express themselves, and this is really a very formal language. And they very often have a hard time putting their results into some kind of a narrative. Humanities, of course, do this all the time. Social sciences, depending, also there's some, the more empirical researchers sometimes feel that, their insight is undersold if they put it in narratives. They want to have statistics up there, And so, yes, so there's a discourse about how to integrate them into narratives. However, once you can create those narratives among different disciplines, the degree of identification is very high. And I think within sciences, there are two ways of integrating. One is mathematics. That's one way you can integrate a lot. And the other one is narrative. So there are no others. And if you want to communicate, you have to say, okay, only math, models, statistics, analytics, is very difficult, even among different sciences. Even among different sciences. I mean, I'm working as an empirical social scientist. Statistics is one of my, it's very dear to my heart. But if I do statistics with physicists, they say, "What are you doing here?" And it's very different type of statistics that we do. It's the same math, but still it's different. The narratives help us to create common meanings. And so I believe it's also very good for communicating within the science system, but it takes training to make sure that the narrative is not oversimplifying things. That's extremely important. Your first question is, I hope I understood it correctly, it's about power of economics and politics, and how is power being related to these kinds of deliberative processes. The issue is, if you are within a deliberative process, and that's kind of what I said, the Habermasian perspective, power is outside of the door. But of course it's not. But it's very clear the rules that you establish, and specifically you say, well, we're talking about arguments, we're talking about insights, we're talking about mutual respect. Everybody has a fair chance to advance arguments and to critique arguments. Then power is not relevant. It's in the back. It's not so relevant. And if you have random selection, it's even less relevant. The one thing that I have experienced over 3 or 4 decades of working with randomly selected citizens, if you have a topic and we have randomly selected citizens, we have, let's say we have 25, you have 3 who are highly educated or powerful. Those 3 will start out as saying what the world has looked like. The others are silent. Then over the first 2 days, they learn more about the topic, and they find out that all these people who spoke in the beginning had no idea what they were talking about. And suddenly it changes. And then the people who had been quiet then say, oh, what you said in the morning, I think it's not quite true, because we just heard from expert X and from them. And then these people say, yeah, well, I'm not that good at that point, and so on and so on. So you suddenly start to get a much more equal footing among people. And I've seen it more and more often that sometimes people have been more silent in the beginning, more into a learning mode, turned out to be much more the opinion leaders in the end. And they were not the powerful. Because the powerful have, one problematic property. They believe they know everything. And that, of course, doesn't work. Oh, I'm exaggerating a little bit. other point, of course, is what we say is the link between these deliberative processes and the policy process. And there, of course, if you come up with specific outcome which is not liked or not preferred by the powerful people, you have a problem. And there are two possibilities. One is to make sure that the mandate is within a range that the powerful people will still accept. That's reality. So if you say, okay, well, we know within the present government or within the present economic system, this is still tolerable, then that has a chance of being implemented. The other thing is, of course, that you would get very powerful allies that in the end pick up and saying, oh, this is so important, this is now very legitimate, they press for it. And this could be campaign groups, this could be NGOs and others that could then take it on. But I think it's very important not to be naive about these processes. We have seen processes, I mean, of one process in which was about waste disposal, where we had a wonderful compromise, but the most powerful parties didn't like it. And as a matter of fact, the leaders of those powerful parties who had participating in this participatory process, who were part of it, were dismissed afterwards by their own parties because they had compromised too much. So that happens.
I think that we right now have already three questions from the online, so maybe we can go through. The second question.
There's somebody in the back.
Already there? So on site? Okay, yes, please. Then we go to the online. Who is on site? Still have the question? Yeah, should be short, right? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, straightforward and short, please.
Okay, thank you. My question is very simple. First, thank you for making it so clear about how difficult and complicated it is to reach net zero in a democratic and a pluralist society. I want to follow about the narratives. It seems to me that, yes, good narratives are important, but who delivers the narratives could also be important. Good convincing narratives, but delivered by the wrong people or the wrong agency, maybe not so convincing. So in the case for net zero at the national level, who should deliver the narratives? In the case in Germany, which government agency or what organization delivers the national narratives? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think what I try to point out is that, you know, if you fabricate a narrative, some people have done this. Sorry, can you hear me? Some people have tried it in Germany to fabricate narratives about the transformation, and they failed. Basically because some people say, it's not my narrative, you know, it's somebody else. So I think what's very important is that you try to co-create these kind of narratives together with the target audience. And so you don't have just one narrative, you have several. And then we give me an example. So what we try to do, again, in one of these exercises that we did, that we had first the scientists come together and develop a scenario about transition, and that scenario was then put into a narrative by people who also have expertise in, let's say, fiction writing. And those narratives are kind of making it kind of, say, imaginable, you know, more closely to the life world. Those were given to these kind of citizens. This was again in one of the German states. And they were saying, okay, this is what the scientists have come up. Those are the 4 kind of options that we have to get net zero in the end. And that's how life looks like in 2030, in 2040, in 2050. And we had even illustrations of this, even animation. And so people could say, oh, now I can see how I could live there. But then the second point was that these people then developed a scenario in which they were part of it. So they're saying, now we asked them to say, this is not a scenario about Germany, but this is a scenario about yourself, your family, your community. And imagine each of these 4 scenarios, how would you place yourself into this? And then they developed their own kind of scenario. And also, it helps them to define their own preferences. Once they, in the first case, they had these 4 scenarios, and you say, well, I don't know. Each of them has advantages and disadvantages. I don't know which one I would choose. But as soon as they were building their own narrative about it, suddenly they felt, oh, this scenario really is more familiar with me if I turn it into my own. The problem with that is clear. You have individual scenarios or individual collective scenarios. But what we also found was that if those people then communicated to others, it was very convincing to others to say, oh, I can identify with the scenario that this person has expressed itself. It was not a scenario by scientists, not by policymakers, but by my neighbor. That was a real change, a real game changer. So it's a little bit more complicated. Don't try to fabricate scenarios. It doesn't work. It's good to start out with narratives that provide choices and that become a display of imaginations that can people understand and identify with. But then that's only the building blocks for the kind of narratives that these kind of groups can then build themselves. And you can do it individually or in groups or in larger groups, but it needs to have ownership of those who do them.
Okay, so because time is closing to the 10:55, so very short, please.
Sorry, I'm
maybe
too long. Yeah.
No, it's okay.
Ortwin, thank you for coming Taipei again. Yeah, my feeling is very complicated because we talk about deliberative democracy earlier. So I think if I a little bit revise your title, Advancing Net Zero Technology in the Democratic and Pluralistic Society, Opportunity and Barrier, particularly in East Asian countries. So for me, how can I say that the feeling is so complicated? Actually, we have to talk about a lot of the Taiwan of some East Asian countries' problems. So until now, by the power dimension, we actually don't have the very good mechanism to actually implement the deliberative democracy. Actually, since 2000, we and Japan or Korea are already transparent. Democracy. But until now, I can see the terms about developmental and environmentalism. That is to say, those regional countries actually invite some civil society, some stakeholder into some meeting. But to the nuclear policy making, they will not be excluded. This is, I cannot say that. And secondly, by our lots of survey, focus groups, we actually very worried about that. Actually, we are lacking a very clear roadmap, narrative toward net zero, because Taiwan is already very delayed to energy transition, and Taiwan suddenly got exposure to net zero. I think this is a big gap between both. So from the governmental agency, from our president, we urge lots of that the government have to get a clear roadmap narrative or the scenario toward 2050. That is unclear, very unclear. And the enterprise now is very anxious to CBAN, you know that, okay? But normally civil society is also very circumventions. So I think overall in Taiwan, this step to net zero is still very far. But I believe that we still need to capacity building as we conduct some opportunity to deliver democracy. Thank you.
Let me make a comment on the narrative that maybe, so the usual way is a very open ways we used in Taiwan is warning, right? If you don't do that, in the next few years you will be died, right? Something like that. In particularly to the industry. I think that is actually what you say with the C-band and so on. Okay, maybe we conclude two questions together, okay? And you can answer. Yeah.
So very short. My question is about, most deliberative meetings in Taiwan is initiated by the government, often for the policy purpose. So, like for the government or the policymaker, they need to make a decision in a very short time frame. But for the society, sometimes developing narratives or working on the social trust. To build up the consensus takes time. So in your experience, I'm wondering, how do you deal with the different expectations from the social side and the government side?
Okay, please, sure.
Yeah, I want to be very short. First, I'm much aware of the situation here in Taiwan, and I'm really also extremely impressed about the progress that you've made in the last 20 years. I mean, that's just fantastic. And I just think I'd have to say that very clearly, thinking about all the other countries around you. Then secondly, trust building, I think, is very strongly related to giving people the feeling of agency. I think that has been underestimated. It's not so much that the things are convincing, but it's also important. But you can have very convincing policies. If you don't feel you have agency, you start to become distant from your government. And if you get them agency, and if you give them the feeling of agency, that definitely helps. It's at least a very important step.
Okay, so the lesson is that we need more time. Right now, come to the online question. The second question, can you give us an example of how you assist and co-generate a person narrative? This sounds really difficult for some people who reject the idea of the global warming. I think the narrative is also difficult for some scientists, right? So not only for the people who reject the idea of the global warming. This is my edit, okay? Where are the crucial obstacles faced the German assembly case? For example, if sufficient enforcement power, how could other states learn from and avoid these obstacles? And the fourth question is, what is the role of the neutral research team in bridging the knowledge gap between the technology government, local people, and the business? Oh, there's another one. Oh, so many.
Go through all
Sorry.
of them, yeah.
Maybe 3 to 4, and then we come to the next round. Okay, then the next round. Sorry, yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, thank you very much. I know we're short in time now. I think I answered already the question about narratives, so I don't think I have to go into that anymore. The crucial obstacles facing the German Assembly case, the problem with the German Assembly case on climate change policies was that it was not initiated by the government. It was initiated by NGOs. And we have one NGO who is run by a German billionaire, more or less, and he put a lot of money into this because he's totally convinced that we need to make that kind of transformation. That is a legitimacy issue. So a lot of people who were opposed to it said, oh yeah, this is a rich person who paid all of this, and this is being manipulated. And so I think it's very important if you have these kind of citizen assemblies that they are being organized by a government or governmental agency. So that they say, okay, we want to know what people think if they are correctly informed. And then you have to make sure, and that's the next question, that the team who's doing it is being seen as neutral. They are honest broker. They're not a part of the debate. And I made it very clear about our own institute. If I am in the role of a moderator, we are not putting any scientific input to it. We are just a moderator, and we have mutual respect Also to people who don't believe in climate change. We'll say, okay, you have your point here, you can make your point, we're not criticizing you. This is our role here. We are process experts, not substantive experts. Then there are others. So we have to make the distinction in between the roles, because otherwise, it's flawed and it's biased. And so, yeah, so that's a neutral research team. Yeah. So we can go to number 5.
Okay, good. Number 5. So can we go further? Number 5 and 6. Go down.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, there's even 7 now.
So maybe you can. Okay, 7 even. Maybe you can read by yourself. How did the Germany randomly select a citizen for the National Assembly? Does it represent all sectors of the citizen? Number 6. How to get the higher power of the mandates to attract the stakeholder to participate. And number 7, in Taiwan, people have very high expectations of the government. Okay, this is our, okay, good. Can we share some tips on citizen participation capacity building for the public sector? That's all, right?
Yeah, hopefully.
That's all.
Okay.
Okay, good. Okay, yes.
Yeah. Okay, can you get 5 again? Because I couldn't remember all of them.
Go down?
Once.
Okay, number 5.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
5, how did Germany randomly select citizens? So there's basically in Germany, every citizen is registered. So we can go to the registration, we take every 500th or whatever address, and that's a truly random selection. However, what we've done in Germany was, once we had done the selection, of course we had only, we selected something like 2,000 people out of 80 million. But it was totally random selecting over all the regions. But then we found out that out of the 2,000, only something like 300 said they would come. And that is a problem in terms of random selection. As I said before, I think to you, in terms of the more vulnerable groups, to you, they don't come. And others who are too busy and so on, they don't come. So we don't get a really representative sample. And so what we did, we had more than the 2,000, actually we had almost 8,000. And then out of those 8,000 that we had selected, we first asked of 2,000 randomly, then we got something like a little less than 200. And then we looked at the 200, we found out that some age groups were not represented, some lower class people were not represented, some people from some areas were not represented. So we looked at the other 8,000 that we randomly selected, and again, randomly, we only took people who had been neglected in the first selection. So in the end, it was roughly proportional to the German situation. So that's how it's been done, but it was always a random selection. There was no deliberate person to be included, because otherwise the legitimacy were wrong. How to get the higher power of mandate to attract stakeholders to participate? Well, stakeholders participate if you give them the feeling that it has power. Stakeholders don't come if it's just information, or if it's more or less nice to be there. Stakeholders want to make sure that it has impact. So very important, again, is it linked to policymakers. You say, okay, whatever comes out of this roundtable will be given to the government, and they will give serious consideration. Then stakeholders will come, because they're interest groups. They want to make sure that their interests are being heard. And last question, in Taiwan, people have very high expectations of the government. Can you share some tips on citizen participation capacity building for the public sector? Well, it's very good that people have high expectations. The problem is, if those expectations are not met, people are becoming extremely easily frustrated. And that's something, again, bad example from Germany. We can see that frustration then leads very often to, extremist versions in the end. And for us, it's a more right extreme at this point. So I think what's very important is, if you have high expectations, that can be good and bad at the same time. If you cannot meet the high expectations, people will be frustrated. If people have no expectations, then they are basically retreating from all kind of public life. So Expectation management is probably the most important element of public decision making. So get the right expectations. And then the feedback from the public can help. I mean, the Citizen Germany Assembly was very good in the sense that it showed the German public wanted to get the transformation done, but they also don't want to have radical measures. It's not very surprising. But at the same time, the government could say, look, you guys, you want to say all cars should be banned within 10 years. The German public doesn't want that. But they want to have a more, slower diffusion. But the German public is very much into climate change policies. So the other side, please, you have the expectation that we don't do that. Well, as a matter of fact, citizens do like that. So it has a real good base for legitimation, and that helps also the government to develop a consistent program. So I think in that sense, that kind of feedback helps to manage these kind of expectations over time.
Okay, I think I would like to thank Professor Dr. Renn again here, and I think that we still have a lot of questions, I think, which we can discuss in the next few days here. So here I conclude this section. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so welcome back to the next session of the morning. This session is a panel discussion on just transition. It will be moderated by Dr. Chia-Wei. He's also a steering committee member of the Taiwan Sustainability Hub and also research director of the Taiwan Climate Action Net Research Center. Speakers include Professor Dr. Ortwin Renn, Dr. Bernardo Jurema from RIFS, and also Professor Dr. Chung-En, who is joining us from online. Okay, so let's welcome them on stage and let's start this panel discussion.
Yeah, sorry, it's a little bit loud. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm the moderator of this session. I'm Chia-Wei Chao. But as a moderator, the first thing I want to warn you is that our lunch time is 12:45. It's pretty late compared to we usually have. So if you are feeling a little bit hungry, the energy is a little bit low, please feel free to take the order stick outside. So that's a very important message. I don't want to see any audience was kind of like fading in the conference room. That will be a little bit trouble for us. Okay, and I'm Chia-Wei Chao, and now I serve as a research director of the Taiwan Climate Action Network, which is a cooperative research project with 5 NGOs. So it's kind of like develop an independent and action-oriented think tank to serve and to monitoring all the net zero transition in Taiwan. So in this session, we invited 3 panelists. The first one is that Professor Ortwin Renn, which you also know pretty well, and I want to highlight that when the Professor Ortwin Renn was come here 2019, he mentioned about the systemic risk we were facing in the overall society, and I remember he mentioned that climate change and the inequality are also the key systemic risk that we have to counter. But in this session, we talk about just transition. So there's some possibility that we can kill in 2 birds in 1 stone to maximize the synergy of the net zero transition and to avoid any potential trade-off that we have seen. So we were looking forward for Professor Renn's brief sharing about the just transition. And there's also some continually discussion about this topic and about what he had mentioned during the keynote speech. We can continue to discuss in this session. The second panelist is Bernardo Jurema. Is that right? Okay. And Dr. Jurema is a political scientist from Brazil, and his perspective on the just transition will more focus on the environmental justice in the global perspective, especially he will put some geopolitical perspective into the just transition discussion, and he will link the just transition discussion with the decolonialism, which was kind of like another aspect we are lacking in the discussion when we talk about just transition in Taiwan. And the third speaker is the climate sociologist from Taiwan, but nowadays he's in US right now, so he only can join remotely. So it's Liu Chung-En 老师. He is from the Department of Sociology from the National Taiwan University, and he is now also the leaders of the very flagship research project on the just transition, which was supported by the National Science and Technology Council. So that's what he will talk more about what our approach in the just transition in that project, and what kind of the key issue he wants to highlight when we talk about just transition in Taiwan. So that's the brief introduction for all the panelists, and I will just take another 1 minute to explain our format for our arrangement for this session. So because we are saying that we organize this discussion in a TSH way, that means that we are very worried about the input from the audience. So we will leave sufficient time for the Q&A, so I can ensure that we can have 40 minutes, at least 40 minutes for the mutual discussion. So you don't need to worry about that, and you can raise your question from the Slido or just raise your hand. And then also we want to highlight that in this session, we try to focus on the root cause of the just transition. So we are not just talking about the general just transition question, like how to retraining, reskilling the laborers, or how to give an additional input of the regional economy. We will go into the root cause of the just transition, not just from the Germany perspective, but from the global perspective, also from Taiwan's context. So that's what we intend to discuss in the brief presentation by the panelists. But if you want to ask some kind of like a key issue, how to implement all the just transition, how to have some kind of dialogue with the labor unions, or talk about the potential just transition issue in the green and the green conflict issue, you can also raise that question during the Q&A session. So we want to cover those two kind of issues. So that's just my brief introduction for this session. So I would like to invite the Professor Renn to give us a short speech, around 7 minutes, talking about what's your perspective on the just transition. So please, please the staff can change the slide, and you can use these pointers. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction. I'm also very glad to introduce to you some of my thoughts according to the just transition. And what I would like to do in the beginning is just to say a little bit about the concepts of justice and how it can be applied to climate policies. And that's what university professors like to do, first to think about concepts. And so I think it's important to distinguish 4 different concepts of justice and fairness. The first thing is what we call ontological, and that means that we have an unequal distribution of rights or duties. So some people are discriminated, and this discrimination is being clearly either stated by law or by practice. And these discriminatory practices can be, for example, towards specific population groups, towards indigenous peoples or others. And so that's something where there are real differences in the way that the law treats different people. Hopefully in a democracy we don't do that, but however in practice we still do this. The second point of justice and fairness relates to distributive justice, and that is that resources or opportunities are not equally shared. And when we say opportunities, it doesn't mean that everybody has to have the same share of resources, because people, of course, have different merits, different possibilities to develop themselves, but they should have equal opportunities to do that. Equal opportunities to get good education, equal opportunities to get the job they want, equal opportunities to get where they want to live. So that's a part of distributive justice, and it shows that there is some kind of an equal distribution of the excess wealth that can be distributed among people. The third one, which I think is extremely also important in terms of climate justice, is recognition. And recognition means mutual respect for each person, independent of the resources or even of the former rights. It's something that is more subjective. If people are not recognized, if people are not respected, if people are not being treated equally, that's something they understand and they feel it. And it's subjective to some sense. Maybe it's not meant that way, but they feel being discriminated or not being taken seriously. And that, of course, is poison in a democracy. If people don't have that kind of feeling, they're not recognized, then, of course, they feel very frustrated. And the last one is the one that have been talked about in my previous presentation, is procedural. That is exclusion from collective decision-making, no agency in the political process, or lack of participation in planning. So procedural justice is that you are part of the process of transformation of policy making. Now, in terms of root causes in Germany, and I was asked to talk a little about Germany, ontological, well, officially, no, all the rights are for everyone, but we see discrepancies between the former East and West. And we can see that in various ways, and it's not just subjective. People have lower wages in East Germany, even for the same time of jobs. They have less opportunities. So that's something that we are facing at this point. It's getting better, but it's not at a good point. Distributive, and if you think about energy, we can see that there's a higher financial burden for the poorer section of the population, percentage-wise, not absolute, but percentage-wise, because, and that's a really important thing, rich people can substitute for fossil fuel, poor people cannot. And that's something what we see. So if you are renting a home, well, there's not much you can do to change your heating system because the landlord is doing that. The landlord is rich, he can change, but the tenant cannot. And so in a sense, if the landlord says no, and if fossil fuel gets more expensive because of taxation, the poor people suffer, not the rich. And that's something we need to take into account. Recognition, well, we see at this point that people who are skeptical about the governmental policies, interesting enough, are regarded as egoistic or environmentally insensitive. So there is a kind of negative framing of these kind of people. So we need to make sure if those people feel that they're not recognized, they will go to the right-wing parties. And so we need to make sure that we also include those who are skeptical. We will never convince the professional skeptics because they're kind of either paid for that or they're just totally, directed towards that. But we have a lot of adherents who don't believe in climate change or believe it's not as serious, and they think to make them or to ridicule them, it's not the right way. And lastly, procedural, we can see that the poor and less educated are less involved in politics, so that's something I mentioned before. Now, this is my last slide, potential remedies. Distributive, I think one of the things that economists say is, well, we need better progressive taxation. So if people have more money that are poor, then they can also afford the changes in terms of energy transition. We need to compensate those who have neither the resources nor alternative options. They cannot substitute. So either we provide them the substitute, that's probably the better policy, or to compensate them for the resources. And of course, we do that, subsidize green energy. So we penalize fossil energy, but at the same time subsidize green energy. Recognition, I mean, it's very clear, create a climate of mutual respect and sensitivity. Also for those who do not believe in the transformations, that's important because they need to know that we'll take seriously any argument, but at the same time refute any argument that's not substantive. And procedural, again, I talked about this improved stakeholder and citizen participation. I don't need to repeat it. And involving citizens designing their own environment. We have seen even in communities with a lot of right-wing followers that if we get them to develop their own community, they suddenly become more skeptical about the right-wing ideology because they sometimes feel it doesn't work. Because the right-wing ideology promises you everything without any trade-offs. And as soon as you get into designing your own policy and designing your own environment, you find out, well, there are conflicting values, there need to be made trade-offs, and the right-wing ideology just doesn't work. And I think that's important that people get that specific experience. And that's all what I want to say, and I'm very glad to give it now to my next speaker.
So, yeah, I think the key takeaway from the brief presentation from Professor Renn is that in Taiwan, we talk about just transition. Most of the scholars know we'll talk about distributive procedures and also recognize, but we did not pay too much attention on the potential remedies in terms to counter those kind of barrier we had identified based on the all kind of course we identify from those three aspects. So I think that will be a key starting point when we trying to bring what we hear from the brief presentation from Professor Renn to Taiwan's context. So I will pass the microphone to Bernardo. Yeah.
So, thank you everyone. Thank you also to the organizers for putting together this event. I think we need more of this kind of event to be incited to think about what's going on and how to answer to the problems that we're going through in the world. What I want to show in this brief presentation here is that the environmental justice movement stems from social conflicts over access to and control over natural resources. These conflicts are shaped by centuries of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. More than anything, just transition requires a reformulation of how nations interact. And that's what I am going to try to show here very briefly. I will try to connect the environmental justice movement with the third world movement from the 60s and 50s and 60s. Here. So one continent's consumption is sustained by extraction and degradation occurring in another. The economic benefits in the northern hemisphere are constructed upon the environmental losses in the south. The practice of effectively transferring emissions from wealthier to less affluent nations has been described as carbon colonialism. That's in fact the name of a recent book that just came out a month ago by Parson. The notion that the global aggregation of small-scale collective action is the key to solving climate change might be the most significant barrier to taking effective action. So Olufemi Taiwo's book, Reconsidering Reparations, which came out last year, is an important contribution to help us think through ways to fight against the climate crisis. So in his book, Taiwo connects reparations for slavery and colonialism to the climate crisis by integrating a global history of racial injustice into a philosophical framework of colonialism and racism. The impact of climate change is not only going to shift societal advantages, but it will do so in a way that worsens the existing historical inequalities. It will undo the progress toward justice that previous generations have fought for, resulting in a period of climate apartheid as described by the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. So Taiwo argues that this presents a double challenge of addressing both the environmental and political consequences. The economic and political systems established by what he calls global racial empire are responsible for both the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the unequal distribution of advantages and disadvantages that determine climate vulnerability within and between countries. So Adam Chau's Road Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, is another book that can help us think about how to tackle the climate crisis. Whereas Taiwo sets out why the consequences of climate change are unequal, Adam shows there were attempts to change that by leaders of marginalized groups in the global north, as well as the colonial leaders in the global south. So Chao explains how anti-colonial leaders from across the Black Atlantic tried to not only cast off European rule, but also end empire by constructing an egalitarian global political and economic order in its place. Chao shows how decolonization was a project of reordering the world that sought to create a domination-free and egalitarian international order. She tells the story of how anti-colonial nationalists sought to overcome the legal and material manifestations of unequal integration and inaugurate a post-imperial world by means of 3 different projects: the institutionalization of a right to self-determination at the United Nations, the formation of regional federations, and the demand for a new international economic order. So when discussing the environment, particularly distant tropical environments, global northern scholars tend to heavily reference individuals similar to themselves. In fact, in 2015, the top 1% of scientific authors were responsible for 21% of all citations. This small group of scholars, primarily hailing from Western Europe and North America, hold exceptionally influential positions in shaping the understanding of the world and its environments. Climate knowledge, like any other knowledge, represents a form of power. The underlying cause of climate breakdown is not a technical issue, but rather a problem rooted in power dynamics. If left to their own designs, third world global south countries could have carried out, in the words of Swedish economist and sociologist Gunnar Myrdal, fundamental changes of international economic relations by their sheer number at the United Nations, where they could carry resolutions like the Declaration on the Establishment of a New International Economic Order. In fact, for global South countries, permanent sovereignty over natural resources was key for challenging the continuing of colonial relations of dependency and unequal terms of trade, and promoting both political and economic self-determination, both of which goals were fundamentally intertwined for post-colonial states and key in seeking sovereign equality. Global economic governance institutions, descending directly from earlier forms of imperial arrangements, exert far-fetched influence over the domestic policies of many states through the power of conditional lending and structure adjustment. Institutions such as the International Monetary Fund have been, in the post-World War period, crucial instruments for the global north to enforce austerity, coordinate the policies of independent central banks, oversee development programs, and regulate commodity prices without generating a backlash. They were a response to post-World War decolonization processes. So it is in this vein that Chia-Wei wrote that anti-colonial activists envisioned a global political framework free from domination, as exemplified by the new international economic order. Their vision encompassed the establishment of norms, treaties, and laws, as well as the creation of new institutions and transformative relationships between nations. So one significant aspect of the reparation politics involved redistributing global wealth from the first world to the third world. Chia-Wei also points to the importance of institution building. Road making, and this I'm quoting Chia-Wei now, road making requires approaching overbuilt environment differently, but also combating stigmas by constructing new sets of norms, informal aspects of social structure, like norms of civility and etiquette, turn our abstract commitments to social goods like trust, attention, and respect into specific behaviors. So in the Global South, social movements have emerged to confront neoliberal states embracing national liberation ideals. These movements, including land movements, water movements, indigenous rights movements, have either achieved success through electoral wins or fostered visions of alternatives to IMF-led globalization. Likewise, the Climate Movement Coalition should be structured around resilient working class institutions such as political parties, unions, and media infrastructure. So for an effective climate movement in 2023, it is important that we have a clear understanding of the history that brought us here. It is equally important that we are aware of the attempts of building a different world, even if they were defeated, and why and how they were defeated. There are no shortcuts. What the history that I sketched here should teach us is that we need to build institutions, media, knowledge production, political organizations that consolidate our vision for a different world than the one that we inhabit today. So in face of the ecological crisis, it is clear that alone we cannot do anything. As history shows us, there's only one way to organize, get involved, and build the institutions that embody the vision of a world as we would like to remake it at the local, national, and international levels. Thank you.
So, thanks for Bernardo's brief presentation. I think there are some keywords we can capture in this presentation. Is that we, like we talk about the fossil fuel imperialism and also the colonialism, which is that we are hardly to discuss in the climate change world, even in the academic field. So I think that will be a thing we can think about. And also we have to think about when we talk about just transition issue, Taiwan is tackle this question from the global north perspective or from the global south perspective. What kind of our unique thinking about that? So that's an issue we can bring back to that. So I will pass the microphone to the John in the United States. So he will he's doing the holiday, but he still managed to have time to discuss with us. So John, floor is yours. Okay.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. So thank you so much for the organizer. I'm actually on a research trip, not a holiday, I hope, but some holidays. Yeah, and so again, also thank Dr. Renn and Dr. Jurema for the contribution. I echo many of the excellent points in the presentation just happened. So in the following 7 minutes, I have a short presentation. I have 3 slides, and Now it should be on full screen. If there's any problem, please let me know. So since last year, I have been involved in a research project on just transition. I'm fortunate to be with a team of excellent scholars. And we are focusing on a few different key areas, including impact assessment. First, we had to figure out what climate change might bring to us in terms of specific populations and industries and how we deal with that. We also focus on the best practices of social dialogues, and we also focus on varieties of legal foundations. And during the process, I do have some reflections that I would like to share. It's pretty immature thoughts, but I hope this will be a springboard for further discussion. So first, in the first slide, I would like to invite everyone to think about just transition as what I call, or sociologists call, a sensitizing concept. So in sociological research, we define two different concepts. The first one is the definite concept that provides prescription of what to see. That's exact concept with very concrete definitions. On the contrary, sensitizing concept merely suggests a direction along which for us to look. And I think just transition is a concept just like that. It suggests us to look to a certain directions. And those directions take us beyond technocentrism that has been central to Taiwan's climate policy making for a long time. So this is a great progress. I think finally we are going beyond just talking about technologies. And talking about just transition also bring inequality and injustice to the focus. And finally, it received more attention. To me, as a sociologist, I feel it's a long deserved attention, but finally it comes. In the process, I also feel like as a sensitizing concept, just transition does not or will not have a universal definition because it's very broad. And to me, it's a learning by doing process and along through dialogue, through conversations, through research, and we'll figure out how we move towards the goal we strive to see. But there's also a danger because as a sensitizing concept, just everyone can give their own definitions and there's different visions on what consists of just transition. So I would like to remind everyone there's a danger that just transition could potentially become a hollow buzzword. That's just, we talk about just transition, but not moving towards a more just and more sustainable world. So in the second slide, I will highlight to the struggle, the internal struggle I have for a long time during this research process. On this slide, obviously echo Dr. Renn's presentation on different varieties of justice. There's procedural, there's distributive, there's ontological, there is also the recognition. And what I find most difficult in thinking about just transition is, I borrow from this paper by Siblett and Harrison, is how do we do things just while have transition at the same time? And there are three different tensions, especially the time dimension is crucial in the process. Number one, we have the tension between inclusivity, that we make sure we bring everybody on board, while we are in the time-sensitive context that we need to decarbonize as fast as possible. But how do we make sure we can do things rapidly, but also inclusive? And I think this is a central question for many audience and many of colleagues and friends have in mind. Second, there's a tension between sustainability and recognition. There are conflicts between performance and recognition of diverse value systems. And obviously there are, for example, in Taiwan, we are fortunate. We have fewer climate skeptics. But how do we value people with diverse and very different opinions while striving to have sustainability performance? Finally, there is also the distributive part, the sustainability and equity tension. That on the one hand, we want to achieve decarbonization as fast as possible. But on the other hand, how do we do that equitably? Right, and these are tough questions. I would love to hear from my co-panelists later. How do we resolve this tension between the tight dimensions and all the different varieties of justice? Finally, my last slide goes to Taiwan's context. I think many topics can be involved in just transition in Taiwan. There is discussion on energy poverty and inequalities. There is discussion on green jobs and industries. But what comes to mind, and I think the most difficult question in Taiwan might be the land conflict with renewables. And obviously this is, not everyone would put this topic onto with the term just transition, but as it consists of distributive justice, apparently, recognition of justice, etc. I think if we put that into this context, this might be Taiwan's most grave challenge, given that we have one of the highest population density in the world, and our land is very scarce. And this will be a difficult thing moving forward. On the other hand, I also think Taiwan does have some good starting point to think to try to make just transition happen. People recognize Taiwan as a developmental state. I think our state capacity is pretty strong, and we have a technocratic tradition that we can, once we get things rolling, we can implement. And Taiwan also it's a young democracy, but I think the democratic system will be key to resolve many of the conflicts we see. And finally, I want to bring out this term. It's a thought. It's kind of thinking out loud. Some of the questions I have in mind. When people first talked about just transition, which is 公正转型, many people confuse the term with transitional justice in Taiwan. That is 转型正义. And at first, I feel, oh, that's just people didn't know. But after a while, I feel like this might be something we should really consider even further, right? As Dr. Renn and Dr. Jurema mentioned, just transition is all-encompassing concept. It's especially important to think about the historical injustices and think about the economic orders internationally and domestically. And Taiwan, as we have the authoritarian past, we have settler colonialism right here, and how do we bring the two things together? And again, also with maybe the colonial perspective, especially when we're thinking about the indigenous rights to indigenous people. This will be key points for us to move forward in the conversation in just transition. So these are some of my current thoughts. I would love to hear from my co-panelists and from the audience and any questions and comments. And thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for John to raise those key questions and then set the scene for the further discussion. And I encourage the on-site participant and the online participant can think about your question right now, because I will open to the floor, and I will take 2 questions first on site, then we will go into the online questions. But before that, I would like to ask 2 panelists on site to dig into some key dimension that John had mentioned about the time, because when we talk about this kind of net zero transition, it's not just 50 years away. It's for Germany, it's 22 years For the other countries, it's 27 years. It's kind of like we don't have too much time to just went back to extend all kind of the historical injustice or things like that. How can we find our way to solving this kind of dilemma between the time we need to have to ensure this procedural justice and also recognition justice, and also the speed of the decarbonization that we need, because we are kind of like, I would say, when we talk about net zero, the time is the most precious resource we have, is compared to land, compared to the labor, or compared to the administrative staff. So what's your thought on that? So I will invite you to give this response to this question in around 2 minutes. So maybe I will invite the Professor Renn start first, then Bernardo, and I will see if John have anything want to add on.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a very crucial question about timing. We are hitting planetary boundaries, and those planetary boundaries are given physically. So we cannot negotiate with nature. So either, we'll have warming or not. So in that sense, the timing is not something that we can put up for discussion, but the timing is there. At the same time, if we want to resolve conflicts with peaceful means, it will take time. And that, of course, makes it difficult to find a good compromise between the physical time that we have and the social time that we need. But what I would like to say is not resolving the conflict will even take more time. And that, I think, is one of the fallacies that we very often face in politics, that politicians tell me, Ortwin, we don't have time, we just have to do it. Well, if they try to do it, they'll face all kinds of conflicts, and in the end, it takes longer than if they had tried to include more people in the beginning, make sure that there are time constraints. And that's something where we press all the time. When we do participatory processes, we say, look, we don't have ample time. We need to act within time constraints, but we still want to make sure that your concerns are taken care of within a time frame that we still have. And that is a challenge, I can tell you. It's a challenge because we have lost time in the last 25 years. If we had been more determined in the last 25 years, I would be less concerned. But now time is running out, and then it's difficult. The one thing that, of course, we hear from more authoritarian regimes is, we as authoritarian regimes can do it quicker. Well, if you look at the performance of authoritarian regimes in the world, we cannot say that they are further ahead in terms of climate change policies. On the contrary, most of those who have been authoritarian in the past or still are worse. And so there should be a lot of caution to say we need a top-down government. As a matter of fact, the top-down governments don't work, at least in this respect. So in that sense, I think we are bound to take that democratic road for many other reasons, but we should also be determined to tell people, look, we don't have the time for all kinds of funny things to do. We need to be really programmatic. We need to be practical. We need to be inclusive, but at the same time, we need to make sure that things are being done before time runs out.
Yeah, thank you, Ortwin. I would just add to that. I would like to point out to one aspect that I think is really important, is that what is halting action on the climate is not too much democracy. Usually it's interests of economic interests of corporations and governments that is an obstacle to carrying out action on the climate. So I think that's something we should bear in mind. Just to illustrate the point, the global north is responsible for 92% of emissions exceeding the planetary boundary, and while the global south bears the disproportionate consequences of climate breakdown. So in a way, there is a very simple way to solve this, and it's just the countries most responsible for the climate crisis could just say, I'm really sorry about what we did, and let's do reparations. But that's not what is happening. I think, just to illustrate the point, the ecological crisis unfolds in a way that resembles colonial dynamics in terms of both emissions and resource usage. So the top importers of biodiversity threats are the United States, Japan, Germany, France, UK, Italy, and Spain, while the top exporters are Indonesia, Madagascar, Papua New Guinea, Malaysia, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. So there's a vertical flow of species and ecological impact towards the global north. So what is halting action, again, is not democracy, but it is the sectors in the world, but also this logic reproduces internally in every country. So those who have benefited from the current systems, economic and political systems, they don't want to give up their privilege because it has been beneficial to them. And that's what is halting climate action. It's not because we've been deliberating a lot. So this is one point I would like to highlight.
John, do you have anything you want to add?
Just a short comment. I just want to echo that democracy is not slow. I think I definitely echo this point. My research is on touch upon environmental authoritarianism, and there's a lot of debate. I think there's a danger that we think authoritarian regime is more efficient, but it's not. I think it's quite clear in the scholarly literature that they are not any more efficient. And what we have in hand is how do we deepen democracy and especially focus on to solve the climate crisis. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks for the response from 3 panelists. I think the key takeaway from here, especially in Taiwan, we always read a lot of narrative saying that China do a lot on the climate change issue. They are kind of like, they build out a lot of the renewable energy in a very pretty short time. So sometimes we even heard, if we are follow their approach, we will be we can accelerate our energy transition. But I will say this is not the way we deal with this net zero transition issue, especially we prioritize the just transition in our old net zero strategy. So now it's time for the floor. So I would like to open the question from the on-site participant. So if anyone wants to have questions, please raise your hand and be very precise. And because we have 3 panelists, if you can say, you can also single out that which panelists you want to address this question to. Yeah. Okay, so we want to invite Professor Chia-Wei. She is also a member of the Just Transition Commission set out by the National Development Council in Taiwan right now. Okay.
Okay, thanks to all the speakers. I think this is quite complicated issues. I have 2 questions. One is that, as all of us have known, there's so many different versions of just transition. We got very neoliberalism version of just transition, or some prefer more like Green New Deal is more emphasize state intervention or a strong state. And we also have a degrowth version of just transition. And we will in the last one, we will emphasize modes, including the unequal development between the global south and the north, or environmental justice, and all kind of justice. And we should put people before profit, or even go beyond capitalism. So I think it's so complicated, and there's so many struggles between different level or different country or community. So I think it's so. I'm just wondering how Virgil you was pursued for, and this is also related to my second question. For me, myself, I will go for degrowth, but in reality, I'm struggling if, like in our case in Taiwan, we are under, in terms of geopolitics, we are under threat of China. And also it seems to us we have to find a way to survive in a global international society. And it's so struggle for me, and we now see the just transition has been mainstreaming in our net zero 2050 policy. It seems very good, but on the other hand, we kind of worry and think what we pursued new liberal forms of just transition. If we go, if all the green growth or green capitalism, mainstream green capitalism policy won't shake by just transition. Okay. It's only become relative. So maybe you can have some, I'm not sure. I would like to hear your opinions. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think because the RIFs have a year-long justice in sustainable ability project discuss those kind of issues, so maybe also Bernardo and Ortwin can bring some kind of discussion around these questions in your response. So I would like to invite Bernardo to give some response to Professor Chou's question first, then Professor Renn. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Actually, the Professor Chou's question is quite that if we want to talk about just transition, if we don't challenge the original thinking about the growth or the economical growth, if we continue to talk about the green growth, things like that, how can we deal this kind of issue? So when we discuss those issues, those justice in sustainable ability issue, does in your research project have talking about we have to pursue for a new kind of paradigm for the what kind of economy we should follow, like the degrowth or just a steady state economy, things like that. Okay.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, but I do think that you were right that unless we question the basis on which our society worldwide is organized, we're not going to find a way out of the current crisis. And yeah, I don't have a good answer because I think this is part of the struggle of trying to and also because it's because of power relations, both internally in the countries but also within countries. It is so hard to do the right thing, quote unquote, because yeah, in theory it's clear what needs to be done. We need to decarbonize the economy. So it's very straightforward. But there is the technology. It's not a technical problem. Again, it's a political problem, and herein lies the difficulty of the climate struggle, because the entrenched interests that have created the problem and that profit off of the crisis, they don't want to change. Business as usual is the policy. And I think the challenge is how to, given the asymmetry of the struggle, how can we find a good solution? And also articulating both national policies, but we can't do this without also addressing the international system, the geopolitical aspects of this. But it's a very hard task, but there's no way around it. And I think that's the main point. It's a political problem. It's not a technical problem. I think this is one of the main points that we have to bear in mind. I don't know. I hope I have addressed your question.
Professor Renn? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe I want to be a little bit more provocative in this. Among sociologists and social scientists, it's very fashionable to say it's capitalism, it's the bad corporations, it's power. And now we go back and feel well, but doesn't change anything. And if you want to change capitalism, if you want to change corporatism, if you want to change power, we lose. Period. I think that's not the way forward. The first thing what we need to do is to make sure that the corporations that we want to address change their policies to be compatible with the planetary boundaries in which we operate. And what I can see is around 30% of the corporations that I know understand it and they want to change. 30% are watching to see what happens, but they are willing to change if the others change, and 30% resist. And I think it's very important that we work with the 30% and show that they have a business model for the future. The other 30% that they go along, and the third 30% to get convinced or to get out of the market. I think that's extremely important. When we talk about stakeholder participation, we're not having only NGOs in mind. We also need the corporate sector, and we need the sector of those who still feel resistant. So that's my first part of the answer. I think it's easy to say, the corporations and the fossil industry and everything else. Yes, it's true, but it doesn't help us. It gives us a good feeling, but it doesn't really change. So we need to work with the corporations. And I think 20 years ago I was more pessimistic about that. I think now a lot of these corporations are willing to change. Let me give you one example, the German car industry. Every third employment opportunity in Germany is within the car industry. So it's, if the car industry is going to go out of business, Germany will go bankrupt, basically. It's the machine industry and car industry are the basic industries that help the German industry or the German society to go ahead. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure first the car industry is working within the planetary boundaries. And that means no fueled car anymore, or only if fuel, then it has to be, regenerative fuel, electric cars, and new mobility provisions. It cannot be that Germany has 56 million cars. That's 20 million too many. So these industries also need to work on new mobility concepts, with bicycles, with everything else. And they can make a business out of this. You have to make them a business model that works and that keep around whatever 19 million people employed, because that's how much people are employed in the car industry and all the value chain in which they are. A small second point where you said degrowth. I'm very skeptical about the degrowth movement. Again, if you look at who advocates degrowth, it's the ones that have more than 100,000 euros on their account. It's the rich people who really promote degrowth. It's not the poor people. And I'm very skeptical about this because it's very paternalistic. I call myself a growth agnostic. I'm saying, if you keep within the ecological boundaries and also social boundaries, whether you grow or not, it's fine, but keep within the boundaries. And if you can't have growth within that boundary, then we don't have growth. But if you want to have innovation, if you want to have some kind of surplus that you can redistribute, if you want people to be creative, you cannot prohibit them to grow. That doesn't work. So my feeling is the degrowth debate is a very abstract, again, a debate that goes, in a lot of nice circles, but there's no model anywhere in the world that I believe has any pragmatic value. So what needs to be done is you have to tell people, if you want to grow, not with all the ecological things that you're doing, not with all the bad social things you're doing. If you keep within those boundaries, and we need to define those boundaries very well, if you find a new product that everybody loves, great. No, that creates employment, it creates added value, do it. If you don't, forget it. And I think if we can keep that kind of pathway, that would definitely help us to proceed.
Okay, so I was a little bit nervous when Ortwin talked about he's quite skeptical about degrowth, because my research team will organize a degrowth forum next Wednesday, so it's kind of like a little bit challenging for us. Yeah. So John, did you have anything you want to say about these questions? About what the Professor Chao had asked. Yeah.
I just want to add just a few words. I want to save time for other questions. I think, the degrowth debate takes a long time. It's very abstract. But I think in Taiwan, it's still worthwhile to challenge the dominant paradigm on unlimited economic growth. I think it has been paramount in Taiwan, and that has been the one and only goal for during elections, for example. I mean that sometimes everything is framed around the economy, and I think there is certain value to challenge that paradigm. But I agree with most whatever the Dr. Renn's point. The thing is to provide a concrete model and to find a pathway, and the degrowth doesn't often show that in their recipe. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to use time to take some more. We'll talk sometime about the more policy political questions. Like there's some other questions asked about the carbon pricing and the just transition. I think the Professor Renn can answer about that. And also is there any example that we can successfully engage with the workers in the car industry when we talk about the phase out of those gasoline car? I think that will be a huge debate in Germany. So I would like to invite Professor Renn to respond to those questions, and then I will invite Bernardo to talk about when we are seeing there's also talk about wealth inequality. So how can we frame those two things together? So I think I will ask the Professor Renn talk about how the carbon pricing design in Germany also have some consideration about the just transition issue.
Well, thank you. The German policy on just transition is strongly based at this point on subsidizing green energy, subsidizing anything that goes into the right direction. That, of course, is the least conflictual pathway, because you don't penalize anyone, you give money out to buy green energy, and then people, of course, saying now it's less costly to rather buy whatever, a heat pump or something else. The disadvantage of this is at some point there's no government money left. And Germany is a pretty rich country, fortunately, but it will not be able to sustain that policy forever. And we're already running at the edge. Now the finance minister is saying we cannot give all the money away. I mean, it's billions of euros that's been gone for people, helping them to exchange the heating system, helping them to buy electric cars, helping them whatever to switch over to regenerative electricity and so on. So this kind of subsidizing the good is certainly one element, but it cannot be the only one. And so secondly, we need to penalize fossil fuel consumption. That means more carbon taxation. There's a big debate in Germany. All the economists love it, even the conservative ones. The government is really very sensitive to this and saying, oh, but it has all these negative effects on distribution, which is true. But nevertheless, if you don't do it, you always have to subsidize even more because fossil fuel is getting cheap. And then, of course, you have to make it cheaper for the green energy. And then you have, ridiculous path towards governmental spending. And the third thing is, what you need to do is to make provisions of what is allowed and what's not allowed. And again, Germany is really reluctant to do that. So, we have to say, well, some practices that are really against climate protection or that are really against green economy needs to be prohibited. And, and we have millions of prohibitions in the German law. I mean, if you want to build a house, the roof, how you design your roof is being clearly demanded, by urban planners to tell you, no, you can't do this, you can't do this, you have to do this. But as soon as it gets to energy, we say, oh, that's against freedom, which doesn't make sense. I mean, if we feel that some things is not good in terms of the environment of future generations, we should also be able to say to prohibit as long as there are other options for everyone. And that is a thing that I think has been underutilized in the German policy, is to make sure that for any fossil option that we have another option that people can actually take, and that they have a choice to do that. Now, in terms of heating system, that's a problem in Germany. I mean, yes, solar energy, but we're not having the same solar power than you have here. So that is a limitation for German households. Heat pumps you cannot do everywhere. Well, what's left? And then, of course, people have a hard time and say, wow, should I do regenerative energy in my heating system? I don't have a choice. And it's very important to make sure that those choices exist. And that is a technological, is an economic issue. And then it's not just subsidizing all these green options, because at the end, the government is going bankrupt. But you have to penalize the others, and at some point to say, you have to install this, or you're not allowed to install this if it's available.
So I would like to invite Bernardo to, I think you can respond to two questions in one response. Is that they also, some participants also ask whether you have seen those kind of climate movement also include those kind of, when we talk about the just transition, environmental justice, from the global south perspective in their consideration, bring the global wealth inequality issue with those climate crisis together. So what do you have observed in those kind of issues?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So to answer the question, I was used also the example of the auto industry in Europe. So for example, in 2015, there was a dam disaster in my home country of Brazil, the Mariana Dam disaster, where the tailings dam of an iron ore mine collapsed, and it led to a toxic brown mud flow that went downstream, and it destroyed the river. It's called the Rio Doce, the Sweet River, and it displaced many communities along the river, and it destroyed the river itself. A lot of this, the iron ore that comes out of this mine is sold to Europe to make cars. So I think this goes to the question of sustainability, where the consumption patterns in the global north has direct social and ecological impacts in the global south. And so there's no way of addressing the climate crisis without addressing this sort of inequality. And so to address the specific question, just as we need to address this, it becomes so urgent to address this, this issue. We see increasing inequality both within countries, but also between countries. And economic inequality also leads to political inequality. So to answer the question very directly, I don't think there is, that a just transition is possible given this enormous political and economic inequality. And I think in order to tackle the climate crisis, we have to address the political and economic inequalities. There's no way around that. Yeah.
Yeah. John, John, did you have anything you want to add? Yeah.
I think we can pass to the next question.
Okay, yeah, but I just want to mention that John had to be the editors for a newsletter published by the TSH. Actually, in this special edition, we have some articles about this issue, about income inequality, wealth equality, and the climate change issue. So I would like to open the questions to the floor. And I just, as a moderator, I have a privilege that I will reserve a question from the on-site participant who was younger than 35 years old. At the last part, as the last question, I did not hinder the hand that I already are raised, but I encourage all the young participants on site. You can prepare some questions. I will choose you as the last one, the last question, and as the obstacle from the lunch. Okay, so I would like invite NT to give some questions, to ask some questions.
I feel like they're still young, sorry. Yeah. I'd like to make a quick comment because on the very important observation and also about the first and second question. I think the just transition, in particular net zero 2050, cannot bypass the original political and economic inequality in this society. You cannot bypass. And the second thing, I think the structure should be changed or can be changed with leverage of the just transition. Because on the one hand, you cannot bypass, but on the other hand, I think we can use this opportunity to raise out or to really make transparency of the existing injustice in this in the present society. Thus, I think this is a quite good entanglement for the both. That's why I see in many countries which can really start the discussion or the action for the just transition and also the net zero and so on. That's simply because they have a very good structure on the background for the discussion, for the action, knowledge to action, and so on. That's why I saw in Taiwan. So in Taiwan, we can say we need also to look back into our original question in this society or the economic structure. Okay, just quick.
Okay, so maybe we can respond to that later with other questions. Any questions on site? Okay, we have Professor Zhou. So okay.
So I pretend I'm 18 years old, okay? Okay. So my comment is very short. In response to Hua-Mei or Obin's comment, actually also the issue to Global South. We know actually Hua-Mei raised the question about the paradigm of economic growth. Actually in Global South or in whole Asia, we actually the global supply chain. So in whole Asia country, we can think they are actually high carbon economic bodies. So this is very serious question. When those kinds of the economic bodies, including Taiwan, not shift from brown economy to green economy. The just transition is very difficult. This is the mindset. In connecting to carbon pricing, Professor Chao now is in this meeting. So when we want to push more carbon tax or carbon pricing in a high carbon society, such as in Taiwan, we actually meet a lot of difficult and challenge from the enterprise. So this is in the roof, in the cap of the mindset of the green mindset in Taiwan is not general. So we scholars are very anxious. Civil society are very anxious. But enterprise is not care about too much about actually carbon pricing. They want to actually exert pressure to the carbon pricing institution is for they get a lot advantage. So I would like to actually respond in comparison to Germany economic model. This is totally different. Again. In whole Asia, this is the global supply chain. They are high carbon economic body. So we actually will face a lot of challenge.
Okay. If I may, I will squeeze some questions from those two commentaries. That when we talk about just transition, it's very important element is that we have to differentiate from the owners of the enterprise and the workers of the enterprise. Because in Taiwan, we always see that if we want to fight against some energy-intensive industry to expand their manufacturing production level, we are facing some opposition from the worker level. But actually, that was kind of like they are just doing good for their owners. So, but when we talk about just transition, we want to talk about engage the labor, and then they can stand with the environmental NGO, climate hawks, talk about those kind of issues. Does Bernardo or Ortwin have this kind of experience about this part? How when we talk about like those kind of emission was coming from those big corporate, but when we trying to engage their workers or even the workers in the fossil fuel industry, they can also recognize they have some kind of they have some motivation want to transit away from the fossil fuel. So I would like to ask Ortwin to give some response.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very crucial issue in terms of industrial policy making. And in my view, you have to do three things. The first thing is that you make sure that your carbon pricing is not coming overnight. So that that's a European policy of the Green Deal. You start with a modest price, and then you say we increase it every year or every second year by a specific percentage. The market is pretty good in accommodating, but you also have to give them some time. But it's very good to be predictable. And I think one of the things that the European Union has failed to do, they made that point, and then when the Ukrainian crisis came, they said, okay, now we can't afford it anymore, and so they reduced the carbon tax again, which of course industry who has already invested in substitutes saying, well, now we have invested in something that doesn't make sense economically. So I think it's very important, even if times are changing in terms of other kind of policy issues, that if you say, yes, we want to increase the price for carbon, and we do it every year by whatever 10% or so on, you keep that pace, because then industry can adopt to it. The second major prerequisite is that you have substitutes. That if you say a specific service, like say a car, people still want to have cars, you have to have enough electric cars, you have to have enough distribution facilities for electricity and so on. You need to get the infrastructure there in order to make sure that the green alternative is viable. And that, again, is not trivial for heating systems, for energy systems, for mobility, and so on. And the third thing is that I think it's also important, which I mentioned before, that you help these kind of corporations to develop new business models that keeps them on the market without going bankrupt. And there was one question to me, I saw it on the screen, if you talk about innovation, what about disruptive innovation, about creative destruction? Absolutely, new technologies come into play. also corporations go bankrupt, that's normal. But if you get 1/3 of your corporations getting bankrupt, well, that's the end of your society. I mean, that's real collapse. So you need an evolutionary model. You can't have a revolutionary model. I mean, that is not going to work if you have a full-fledged economy. So I think those are the three main conditions. A steady increase, which keeps the ability of markets to accommodate. Secondly, to make sure that green alternatives are available. And third, to help these businesses to develop alternative business models. And I think that could also work for Taiwan. I don't know, I know not enough about Taiwan, but I think it's a kind, I mean, business people are fairly international, and they, you know, if you can make those three arguments to them, and they want to be also adaptive to future needs, that may be enticing also for, you know, skeptical industries to go along.
Okay, John, did you have other thing you want to say about the question we just mentioned about the commentary we coming from the NT and the Professor Zhou?
Yeah, I just want to quickly echo. I think carbon pricing is essential, and Taiwan has been lagging behind for so long. And I think Europe have the EU ETS since 2005. And it's 2023, and we still do not have a proper carbon price in Taiwan. It's coming in a couple of years, but it's too slow. And of course, how do we make the three conditions, like Dr. Renn said, happen in Taiwan? It will be crucial. And I think carbon, yeah. I'll stop here and let's move on to the next question.
Okay, so maybe we have time for, because the online question is not so related to the just transition, maybe we will discuss that in the other session. But I want to ask, is there, we have two, okay, so we have another question from the social age under the 35 years old, yeah.
A quick question about the how the revenue of the ETS and how the revenue of the pricing, carbon pricing or tax to be used. Will that induce another issue of just transition, because we talk about the subsidize, and the subsidize you need to the money comes from. So so did you see the just transition problem of the how to use the revenue of the ETS? Okay.
So I think for the ETS issue, that will be more belong to Ortwin's expertise on that. Okay.
Well, most of the German economists believe the best way to do this is to redistribute the money proportionally to all German households, because this has a regressive effect, meaning that the poorer households get more proportionally and the richer get less. And we did focus groups on that solution, and most people didn't like it, because it looks like you hand out money to everyone. So people, when we ask them, they say, please redistribute it either just to the poor people or invest it in better green technology. And I would probably go along with that. I can see the point of economists, which is saying it's simple. You just, you know, distribute the money proportionally to all households, and then you don't have to distinguish who is poor, who is not poor, and you don't have a demarcation line. But generally, I think if you also talk about subjective understanding of fairness, people don't think it's fair to give the very rich people a payback. Even if for them it's just pocket money, but for others it's not. So I think we need to be very sensitive to the perception of what the redistribution of the money means. And in my view, I think it would be very good to develop or to use the money for green substitutes specifically directed towards poorer population. For example, one of our, actually at RIFs, we made a suggestion there, which we actually also calculated through. If you give tenants the money to modernize their homes without involving the money of the landlords, so the rent is not going up, but the tenants are getting the money towards, say, we have new windows or a better insulation. That saves a lot of money in terms of fuel, and then they can afford to have more green fuel. And at the same time, it has a clear effect on the poorer part of the population. So we need an intelligent redistribution system.
Okay, so we will only have 3 minutes left for this session. So I think Ortwin already responded to another question. So I will invite Bernardo and John to give some final remark of the discussion. And then regarding to the question we asked about ETS, I know that in EU now we set out the social climate fund using kind of like using the revenue from the ETS to focus on those minority group and also tenants. I think that's also a model that we can refer on. So I would like to invite Bernardo to give some final remark about the discussion around this session. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would like to end on a note just to emphasize the main point that I've been trying to get across with my intervention today, is that the historically ingrained economics of environmental vulnerability cannot be overturned by a single country alone. So while 2 centuries of carbon emissions may have heightened the risk of natural hazards, it is the context shaped by 5 centuries of dominance that influenced their impact. So I think I would highlight just taking into account the history of how we got here, and this should inform how we can find ways to tackle the climate crisis. We cannot ignore this history that created the climate crisis. I think that's the main point.
Okay. So John, did you have anything you want to say before the lunchtime and your sleeping time?
Thank you, Dr. Chao. I will conclude my 1-minute remark. So I learned a lot from my co-panelists, Dr. Renn and Dr. Jurema. I think from Dr. Renn's comment, I think it's incredibly important for Taiwan to come up with a viable pathway that incorporate rich insights on the redistribution of the climate funds, etc., and so that we can step by step going towards that direction. And I also really value Dr. Jurema's intervention on we should think at a global level, how do we challenge the current economic order that is basically propagating the unjust situation. And I think for Taiwan, it's important to put us in the global supply chain to, on the one hand, to really recognize our position. On the other hand, to really bear responsibility, because in many cases, Taiwan is like a northern country, or is a northern country in terms of economic relations. We are in the middle, but in some sectors, I think we are more like Germany than other countries. But on the other hand, I think politically, of course, we suffer from the political inequality in the international arena. There is no say for us on the international stage. So it's important to I think for us in Taiwan, doing just transition, besides thinking about the domestic situation, it's important to kind of have that reminder how to put us on the global scale. So I'll conclude here, and good luck. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you enjoy your lunch.
Yeah, so it's lunchtime, but I just invite you to give applause for all the panelists for their discussion. Yeah, okay. So I will pass microphone for Ms. Liu. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So before lunch, I know everyone's very hungry right now, but we have a few announcements because today we are going to encounter an annual military drill in Taiwan.